Well, when we started, I wanted to have a name for a band that really captured the element and aesthetic of wood smoke on a winter night. That smell and just that feeling. And so, I didn't want to use a word or whatever that was just as prosaic as wood smoke, but eventually I found the word Agalloch. It was just in an old dictionary. And it's a type of wood that's burned for its unique smoke, and so it was perfect. It was perfect for what I wanted, and it didn't pigeonhole us into one stylistic corner, genre, whatever. And so that was the name we went with, and it's perfect.
Well, I met John in 1996 through a mutual friend. We were both at the time putting together demos for our individual projects. Mine being Sculptured, his being Agalloch, and we had tremendous amounts of things in common with regards to music, cinema, and so just naturally we started collaborating. And so when it came time to do For Much of This Oak demo, I came down to the studio, did some guitar solos, and thought that was going to be it, and that I was going to go on and focus on my own project. But as it turns out, another mutual friend, Jason Walton, flew out to work with me, ended up working with John, and from there we began forming Agalloch into pretty much a full working band. And that's when we started charting ideas for what eventually became Pale Folklore.
I met John in 1991. We were both living in Montana, and we were in high school, and we were both in different bands in the Montana area. We got to know each other through there, and we played a couple of shows with each other, and so we've been good friends for a very long time. And years and years later, he introduced me to Don, and at the time Don was just starting Sculptured, and he released the first demo, and I heard it, and I was living in Minneapolis at the time, and I wanted to leave. So basically Don and I became really good friends, and I moved out to Portland to join Sculptured. And John was living here as well, so that worked out really well for everybody. So this was after the first Sculptured album was recorded. So Don and I were working on Sculptured, and John was working on Agalloch, and it was after the first Agalloch demo as well. And just because we're all good friends and we all had the same taste in music, we started to work on Pale Folklore together.
The attitude of the band since the beginning has always been a very take it or leave it kind of attitude. We've never really wanted to ever give in to any sort of hype or what care what the scene is doing at the time. We just do what we do. We enjoy what we do, and we just kind of put it out there, and it's like take it or leave it, love it or hate it, but we're not going to take it any further than that in terms of promoting ourselves or anything, because I've never been interested in that, and I've never really been interested in the whole concept of following a linear path to success or whatever. I've always just been more interested in cultivating and maintaining a strong cult following, and that's the most important thing to me and to us. And if success or whatever comes from that, then that it's just going to naturally happen, or it won't. So that's the attitude that we've always had, and the attitude that we still have and will always have until the end.
I mean, Pale Folklore is still an album that I feel a great deal of pride for, and I still listen to it regularly. And I feel like at that time we achieved what we wanted to achieve. We had very specific, I think, direction with this album. We had our points of departures being Fields of the Nephilim, some of the older Catatonia, and of course the early Ulver work. We kind of wanted to combine those three and bring the sort of Fields of the Nephilim mood to sort of black metal. And I remember when we recorded Pale Folklore, we had a friend visiting at the time, and we hadn't laid down the clean tone guitar parts yet. And when we did, a friend remarked he didn't like them at all. And so we knew we were doing something hopefully original at that time. And I think we started kind of maybe a new sound with that, sort of mixing that clean tone guitar going over sort of heavy black metal guitars. And I find that to be pretty much a key identity peg for Agalloch.
Pale Folklore was a really interesting experience for all of us, I think, because it was our first exploration into Agalloch as a full band, and it was a journey of discovery for us, and it was basically us getting together and creating an album that we all wanted to hear. It had a lot of different influences, from Ulver to Catatonia to Fields of the Nephilim, bands that we all appreciated, and it's a record I still look back on today, and I feel like we made a really solid record that still stands up.
That album, although it wasn't a conceptual album per se, it definitely followed the kind of a sort of red thread, and I think I remember telling the engineer when we were creating it, that I wanted it to be the sort of album that, imagine, you're lost in the woods and it's snowing and it's cold and you're gonna die if you don't find a shelter or something, and the wind is blowing and it's brutal, and you find like a cabin that's falling apart, ruins of a cabin, and you make it to this ruins of this cabin, and you open the door and it's illuminated and there's a fire and it's warm, and it's kind of like a transformation from life and death, from this coldness, brutality outside and of life, and of death being this kind of warm, comfortable place, and that rundown cabin in the woods is where you're going to be forever. And that's kind of what I told the engineer. I kind of gave that story to the engineer to sort of paint this aesthetic picture of where we wanted to go with that album, and how I wanted that album to feel and whatnot. So that was Pale Folklore. There's certain things on it, looking back, sure, I would like to change. I think it would be a lot better if we did an album like that nowadays, but that's where we were in 1998, 99.
With The Mantle, I feel like this was an album that we made where we felt the most that there was endless possibilities with where we could go. After having done Pale Folklore and made that sort of more black metal statement, both John and I were spending a lot of time in Portland, discovering new music together, and we went and saw Godspeed You Black Emperor live, and it was very inspirational. We felt like what was going on with that sort of so-called post-rock scene, those sort of groups, could really easily translate into black metal. And we were also listening to a lot of like Nick Cave and the Bad Seeds, and we really wanted to bring that and also the neo-folk stuff we were into with Current 93 and Soul Invictus, and we thought maybe we could make an album where we are able to synthesize all of these different styles that we see as certainly related in terms of they're both, it's very dark music. So it was a long and sort of arduous recording process, and I think we had a very big scope and sort of a very large concept that we were trying to sort of wrestle onto to make some sort of cohesive statement, and I'm not quite convinced it's the most cohesive statement, and this is why I'm somewhat surprised it's such a favorite album. But I remember it being just a really open space of possibility in the studio and the songwriting, and we definitely took some risks with the piano and the guitar work and different instrumentation with the double bass and the accordion, but I felt like that there was nothing we couldn't do with The Mantle, and it's an album that I'm certainly very, very, very happy with to this day.
The Mantle was a massive undertaking for us. We spent a lot of time in the studio, spent a lot of time writing it, and it was kind of a critical album for us because Pale Folklore had a lot more success than we had anticipated. So it was kind of our chance to make our grand album. And so we spent a lot of time on it, and it just turned into this massive project that turned into many, many headaches and many problems. But in the end, again, just with Pale Folklore, it's we can look back on it with pride and think that we basically tackled this big monster of an album that we were trying to create. And I still look back on it and I listen to it very often, and I'm very, very proud of it.
The Mantle was an album that was created during a period of time when we were not so interested in metal anymore. Kind of took a break from it. I was really not interested in what was going on in the scene or any new bands at that time. And plus, right after we recorded Pale Folklore, I left for Finland for a while. And while in Finland, I became very aware and a big fan of electronic music. And, you know, so I kind of brought that back when I came back. And, you know, we were very much into the so-called neo-folk scene, more than we'd ever had been in the past. And as well as like the whole industrial kind of scene from the 80s, early 90s, like bands like Swans, Agalloch, and of course some newer sort of post-rock stuff like Mogwai and Godspeed You Black Emperor, and, you know, Sugar Rose and stuff like that at the time. So all of those kind of influences, those non-metal influences, really pulled together on that album. And once again, when we were creating that album in the studio, I kind of told the engineer, you know, well, this album is basically sort of like traveling from Portland to Mount Hood and back in a way, because the way the songs are structured together in that album, aesthetically and atmospherically, is kind of like the album starts at Crown Point, where the photograph of us was taken for the vinyl. That sort of panoramic vista, and it travels down through the old highway towards Hood River. And then if you take Hood River to Mount Hood, and you go through the mountains and the wilderness and stuff, and then back to Portland, and then back to Crown Point. And so it kind of that whole album follows this kind of circle that ends kind of where it began. Obviously, you would only understand that if you're from Portland or from this area. But that was kind of the basis that we built that album on, and it's very different than what I think a lot of metal bands do. You know, especially a lot of bands that I don't want to say pretend to be something they're not, but, you know, who utilize their local influences. I mean, that's basically how we utilized ours. And I think from an outside perspective, that album might sound a little bit confused, but it makes perfect sense if you're from this area. And that was our Portland album, basically.
Portland is a very important place for me, and I really think that the Mantle really encompasses so much of the aesthetics and so much of the vibe of Portland, not only the artwork, but the music, the themes. And I think that if you listen to the Mantle and you're familiar with Portland, you will get the references. You can understand where Hawthorne Passage comes from, and Desolation Song and things like that. You can really appreciate and understand where the lyrics, where the themes are coming from, the imagery. It all wraps up, and it just, the whole thing just screams Portland.
And then, you know, after we'd done the Mantle, it was, you know, we looked back on it and we felt like maybe we need to really redefine and refine the sound. And so we wanted to make Ashes a bit more of a succinct statement. It's more of a back to basics record, which I don't think there was anything else we could do after the sort of sprawling, you know, miasmic recording of the Mantle. And so we really sort of stripped down. And I think what was interesting about Ashes Against the Grain was that our experience of redeveloping to a live act, where we had to cut back in order to present tracks from the Mantle into a live context with just two guitars, bass, vocals, and drums. It taught us what we could do with very little. And so I think we kept the album basic as a sort of inspiration from playing live, and that's always usually been inverted.
Ashes Against the Grain was an album that we had to do at the time. We had really immersed ourselves so much into the Mantle that we just needed to have an album that kind of rocked more. It was a bit more stripped down, and it was just pure energy and emotion. Because the Mantle was definitely not that; it was more subdued. And so, also at the time that we were writing Ashes, I was kind of having a renaissance with metal again, because I was really listening to a lot of bands that I had discovered, a lot of newer bands at the time, as well as a lot of cold wave stuff like Antarctica and once again Sigur Rós and bands like Thule from Norway, the prog band, and we were listening to a lot of dark progressive rock. So once again, those influences came together, and we just created this album that was a bit more stripped down, and it just rocked more. And I think people were kind of afraid of what we were going to do when I gave that press release saying that it's a bit more rock based. But I think that album is one of our heaviest albums because it is so focused on electric guitars. And
when we started writing and recording for Ashes, we really decided that we wanted to make a little bit more of a stripped down album. And it was the first album that we recorded after we became a live working band, touring, playing shows. And because of that, it really changed the way that we wrote the music and the way we approached the music. With an album like The Mantle, the sky was the limit. But unlike Ashes, we really wanted to kind of make it just more compact, more stripped down, and a really powerful statement.
Amidst the 3 full lengths, I think we've always really wanted to take our time between them and use that time to sort of indulge ourselves and experiment with what I would consider to be the more marginal sounds of Agalloch. So for example, we wanted to do a noisier rock sort of recording, and we wouldn't want to do a full length like that. And so we came along with doing the Lodge and reworking it for the live, which led to doing this EP, the Gray EP. But and the same thing too with the White EP being a sort of straight folk EP. For my theory for these EPs is that we don't want them to be major statements of our discography. For me, when you hear the full length, you're hearing the center of Agalloch, whereas the EPs are kind of the margins, it's kind of the fringe. It's where I feel like we have the most freedom to really indulge ourselves and really develop some of the more fringier aspects of our sound, which I think ultimately helps define our overall sound that we finally release on a full length. But that's why we like to limit them. And that's why we like to continue doing them. And I think that's something that we'll always do as just a way to continue playing with and experimenting our sound.
Well, the EPs that we release, they're studies. They're a way for us to kind of step away from the album process, which is very developed and very, there's a lot that goes into that. And kind of step away from those kind of pressures and put out something that's just either a study of a certain aesthetic or just for something that's just enjoyable, like that split 10-inch that we did with our friend over in Finland, in Nest. That was pure joy to record, and there was no pressure in the studio, and it was fantastic. And the same could be said about the Gray EP and the White EP and all of that stuff. Like I said, it's a way for us to just kind of step back and study a certain aesthetic, and sometimes the study pays off and we end up using certain things, certain elements of that on our next recording.
With the Gray EP in particular, I did a remix of Odal, and with that I took little tiny samples of different pieces of the guitars, of the drums, and I made this kind of massive piece of noise. Basically, it was ambient noise, and a lot of the fans, a lot of the critics hated it, but it was a statement that we were making, and it was just a piece of these minor works that the EPs are. With
Agalloch Live, it's a very different band, And what I appreciate about when we emerged as a live act was the challenge it presented to itself, the challenge that it presented musically, which was we ended up having to rewrite a lot of the material and really rethink how can we, reach the same sort of epic proportions of some of the music with very limited instrumentation. And so I found it to be a productive and positive experience. And if anything, it just brought out a brand new side, a brand new feeling of Agalloch that we never anticipated being there. And so this is why I think I'm very excited that there's the DVD out now and that this side of Agalloch is available, because I think it's very, very different than what you hear on the albums.
Playing live was never a big priority for us. We were more interested in just making demos and then making albums and focusing on that thing. We started to play live just because we were curious if we could pull it off. And the original intention was just to play 3 shows and then have that be it. But it seemed to work out really well, and those 3 shows turned into a short West Coast tour, and then it turned into a East Coast tour, and then it turned into a European tour, and then, and it kind of kept going, and we kept developing what we did live and some of the aesthetics that we would bring to our shows. I'm very much into having banners and fog and those kind of things enhancing the live performance, as well as we burn natural wood smoke incense on stage, and I don't think it's very common in the metal scene. It's sometimes utilized in the neo folk scene, but for a metal band, I think it's kind of unique to us, and we do this to sort of set the tone of because sometimes how certain aromas and stuff will trigger a certain feeling. I think it fits perfectly with our style of music and the feelings that we have in our music. So live, it definitely will burn this natural wood smoke incense, and it will sort of fill the air with this aroma that highlights what we're doing. And I think that's something that we will continue to do until we stop playing, because it's a feature that I think is really, really works for us, and it really works for creating that enchanting atmosphere live.
Agalloch Live is completely different than going into the studio. It's a very cathartic experience, and it shows a totally different side of the band. A lot of the songs are rewritten, reworked, rearranged. We approach them differently, we think of them differently, and Agalloch Live is the only time you're going to be able to really experience those versions of those songs. And it's really important to us to breathe new life into the songs live. And so really this DVD is really important to us because it's the first time we're able to document that appropriately. For example, in The Shadow of Our Pale Companion, it's a completely different experience than on the record, and it's nice to have our songs are like living, breathing beings. They keep changing, they keep evolving, and this DVD really documents that well.
This DVD release came about when we were getting ready to play the Ragnarok Festival. When we got invited to play that festival, a good friend of ours, who's a promoter and an owner of a record chain in Belgium, invited us to play again in Belgium, and one thing led to another. I mean, originally it wasn't going to be a DVD release, and up until a few weeks before it actually happened, we didn't even know if it was going to be filmed. But we just basically, he rented a camera crew, and we brought Chris from November's Doom to do our sound, and we just did it as if it was a normal Agalloch show. And I think it turned out really well. I think the final edit with the entire show being in black and white is very evocative. I think it's far more interesting than a color show, especially when you got the type of thing where you don't really have control over the type of lighting that's going on, because we don't really have a lighting guy. But you can do so much more with black and white in terms of just creating a bleak feeling. And we wanted the show to look like a Bela Tarr film, or something like that, or an old Bergman film. It has that monochrome black and white kind of aesthetic, and stuff. So that's why it's in black and white. I hope you enjoy it. If not, well, go watch something else. But it also, that monochrome attitude and approach that we took with the actual editing of the DVD or of the show definitely highlighted the photos that Valletta Thorson took while we were in Belgium of these old graves on a nature preserve. Folk metal. Well, when we started, we didn't set out to be a folk metal band. It's a style that kind of found us. It seems, although we're not really affected by what goes on in the scene and the changes and what comes and goes, it seems that sometimes, because of our broad style, we get lumped into a lot of new subgenres that come along. Like, for instance, in the early days, we never set out to be a post-metal band either, but when the Mantle came out, there weren't that many so-called post-metal bands, as they're called. But as soon as that scene developed, we suddenly got lumped into that. And the same with folk metal. My attitude towards folk metal is that we don't really play pagan-themed party music. For us, the heathen and pagan influences, they're intertwined in the fabric of what we do, and so we don't really use. Any band can put a bunch of runes or Viking emblems on their record and call themselves Viking metal or folk metal, despite the fact that maybe they just play boring death metal. For us, it's that stuff is just interwoven into the fabric of what we do, and so we don't really use that as a shield for anything. But yeah, as far as scenes are concerned, like I said, we never really try to pay attention to what's going on with just new subgenres that come along. We just kind of sometimes get sucked into them by the press or by fans or whatever. There was one smart aleck in the press who put the genre tag of gray metal on us, and I think it fit for what we were doing on the Mantle, but overall it's not something that I would call our style. Since day one, we've been dark metal. It's just pure and simple, very broad, and that's I think where we'll continue to place ourselves. I'm originally from the Pacific Northwest, but I grew up in another state. But when I came back, I really forgot how stunning the nature is here, and how it so well fits with the aesthetic of black metal and things like that. It's in the same way that I guess Norway does. And I think that's one reason why you're starting to see something happen here with a lot of these kind of neo-pagan kind of black metal bands popping up in this region. Is I think it just has something to do with what the kind of nature and natural surroundings we have here, and it's very, very powerful. As I say whenever it gets brought up, there's something here that haunts me, and I think it's definitely a strong influence on us.
With regard to the future of Agalloch, here we are. We're about almost reaching 11 years or so now. And I think we're all at the age where we can sort of look back and reflect. And I don't think there was ever a moment where we really genuinely wanted to stop or give up. It feels like we're always thinking about it. Certainly Agalloch has become a significant part of my identity, of who I am. And I still feel even to this day that we're always excited about what's next. And I feel like we're lucky to have established a sort of musical narrative where we can experiment and develop and push on the sound, and that'll be expected by our listeners. So I don't see us ending anytime soon.
So this is the first weekend in December of 2008, and we're getting ready to start working seriously on our next record. And we have some stuff written right now, and I'm very, very excited about it. I think our next album is certainly going to topple the other ones that we've made, and that's the way it should be. We're always striving to create the most expressive work we can, and I think it's going to be no different. Plus, when we make an album, we always wipe away the past. We forget that we have anything else out. It's almost like creating a debut again, because that way you can create from a purely fresh start. And I think the fact that we have 3 very distinct albums is a tribute, or is because of that. But yeah, our next album, I'm hoping we'll finish it next year. But if not, maybe it'll come out in 2010. That we're never in a hurry, and we never rush what we do. We prefer to, take our time and create something that's gonna have longevity to it, and that's what's the most important thing to us.